Right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for being here today. There's quite a bit of interest in the results of this poll that we're going to talk about today. There's at least 90 of you registered, and we are recording today's presentation. For those who are new to Neighbors Welcome, Rhode Island, we are a growing network of neighbors who advocate for strong and sustainable housing production across our state. We're working to ensure that all Rhode Islanders have housing options that meet their needs at every stage of life. And we support all types of housing, including affordable, and we work on zoning and land use reforms that enable thoughtful, common sense development of smaller homes within the existing built environment. Today, you'll see a presentation by national polling firm YouGov about a public opinion poll that Neighbors Welcome commissioned to better understand how Rhode Islanders think about the housing shortage, continued rising costs, and the various policy strategies to address it. Following that, there will be a response panel discussion with state leaders, including Representative June Speakman, Senator Jake Bissaillon, Catherine Taylor of AARP, and Randy Rossi of the Rhode Island League of Cities and Towns. There will be opportunity to post questions and comments in the Q&A feature, and we have teams from both Neighbors Welcome as well as YouGov doing their best to answer all your questions. So with that, I will hand it off to Neighbors Welcome Executive Director, Chris Brown.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today, we are digging into the results of a statewide poll that shows housing is a pressing concern for voters of all demographics. Across Rhode Island, housing is unaffordable today because there are not enough homes to meet community needs, and competition is driving up rents and home prices. Rhode Island has ranked dead last in the country in building homes for the last 3 decades. It is estimated that we need around 24,000 new homes to meet existing needs and increase the supply to a healthy vacancy rate. In February, the Rhode Island Association of Realtors reported that home sales hit a 15-year low at the start of 2026. With low inventory and high demand, market pressure continues to result in rising costs of housing. The median home sale price continues to break record and currently stands at $514,000, with many neighborhoods, including my own, seeing sale prices of over $700,000. The statewide average rent for a 2-bedroom apartment is between $1,700 a month and $2,300 a month, depending on geographic location. These numbers are well out of reach of average household incomes in Rhode Island. With rising home prices and rising rents, Rhode Islanders feel trapped in trying to keep the homes that they have, even when those homes do not meet their needs. We have older residents who've given up on downsizing, young people out of college who are stuck living with their parents, and working families unable to access the dream of homeownership. We see the number of Rhode Islanders experiencing housing insecurity and homelessness skyrocketing. Rhode Islanders are ready for change. The poll numbers that we'll discuss today show that across ages, incomes, and local communities, voters support building more homes. They want housing options in their communities at reasonable prices, and they support elected leaders who are working to make that happen. With the reforms that have been made over the last several years under the leadership of Speaker Sicarci in the General Assembly and the establishment of the Executive Office of Housing and investment in affordable housing, we are starting to see progress. Recently, the Executive Office of Housing reported that 3,778 units were permitted in 2025, a 40% increase from 2024. This represents the largest number of new permits for housing in a single year since the 80s. While permitting numbers are extremely encouraging, average Rhode Islanders are suffering now from the lack of housing and high costs. We need to allow more homes of all types across the state to meet the needs. Ensuring sustainable housing production is critical to addressing this crisis. With more Rhode Islanders feeling the negative impact of lack of options more than ever, it is necessary that state and local leaders work together to implement solutions. Today, I'm very excited to continue this discussion with our panelists, but first, I'd like to introduce John Ray, Senior Director of Polling from YouGov, to walk us through the poll results. Turn it over to you, John.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everybody, for having me. I'm John, Director of Polling at YouGov, based in Austin, Texas. So what I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to help set the stage for our panel discussion by walking through some of the key results of a survey that YouGov ran with Neighbors Welcome Rhode Island. I'm going to hop over to screen sharing in just a moment and walk through some of the key results. There's a lot of data in this survey. Lot to know about, opinions toward housing in Rhode Island, but I think Chris has set the context here quite nicely. I think we're going to see some pretty clear indications of what Rhode Islanders, want their government to be doing. So I'm going to go ahead and hop in, and I will pull up some quick slides for everybody. And so, presentation kind of rules apply here. I'll be in screen share mode. So as you're thinking about questions, comments, stuff that you want to add to this discussion, feel free to leave things in the chat, and obviously we'll have time for discussion as well. Okay, so what are we talking about here today? So we're going to be talking about a survey of 600 registered voters who live in Rhode Island. The survey was in the field earlier in the spring, kind of went through middle of March, and this is a survey that is representative of the population of registered voters in the state of Rhode Island. The margin of error for the survey is about plus or minus 5 percentage points. Okay, so at the beginning of the survey, even before there was really any kind of context, before people were really thinking about housing, before there were sort of specific policy questions, we just began the survey by asking people, what are you worried about in your daily life? What are the key issues that you're sort of most concerned about for Rhode Island? And at the beginning of the survey here, what this chart shows us at this very top row, that the cost and availability of housing is the top issue concern for voters in Rhode Island, above things like inflation, healthcare costs, taxes, the availability of jobs. This is, I will say, I think, two important pieces of context here. There are plenty of other states where we see a similar trend. We really have seen the cost specifically of housing rise as a concern in a lot of places. To be blunt, the only places where that's not the case are states that actually build a lot more new housing. But this is quite, this represents a statistically meaningful increase in data that we're seeing over just the past couple of years, where, concern about inflation, about rising costs, if you really press people on what they mean by that, increasingly they mean specifically the cost and availability of housing, which is currently the top concern for voters in Rhode Island. Throughout the survey, we also tried to get at kind of, from a bunch of different directions, the question of, how do you feel about how good of a job your government has been doing on this issue so far. There are several different ways that we try to kind of measure that in the survey. I won't bury the lead here. They all basically say the same thing. From a bunch of different directions, people are shall we say, they're excited for the prospect that their government could be doing more to increase the housing supply in Rhode Island. And I think that's going to kind of set the table for the more specific policies that we asked about, which I'll get to in just a minute. But so we asked, do you think that, do you feel like there are enough homes? Do you feel like, there's enough housing in your neighborhood? Do you feel like too many people are moving in? Most people say that there are not enough homes that are affordable for average people in Rhode Island. That's fully about 80% of the sample. Crucially, I will try not to say this for every single piece of data that we've got here, but I think important context here also is that these results hold across kind of the key demographic factors where you think there might be a lot of variation in how worried people are about housing. So what do I mean by that? This 80% of respondents who say that there's not enough housing in Rhode Island. This 88% who say that the state legislature should be doing more to address the housing shortage. That's going to include, in the 80% of, people who live in Providence, who live outside of Providence, who are higher income, middle class, lower income, who are renters or who are owners. It really is a widely shared kind of feeling that the cost of housing has gotten too high in Rhode Island. Down here, there's also this chart where we just sort of ask people, how would you rate your own cities or towns' efforts to keep housing affordable? And the left-hand side here, these little slivers of respondents are the share of voters so that they think that their local area is doing a good job. So I think that's some context for us to consider. Clear appetite for more action on the subject of housing. Something else I think is really important is that we also really tried to kind of press respondents on, what the implications might be of that type of policy that would result in more housing in Rhode Island. So later in the survey, we also included a question where we basically said, if you really had to choose, on the one hand, we could be in a world where we're protecting neighborhoods from change. We're kind of helping preserve their character, or sort of keep neighborhoods the way that they historically have been, or should we prioritize building more housing? And we try to include wording in the survey that really try to kind of make that trade-off explicit, right? This trade-off between preserving neighborhood character versus building more housing. And again, just go to the next slide here. These kind of greenish bars on the left represent the share of respondents who say that they prioritize creating more housing options in Rhode Island over the share of voters who say that they prioritize protecting neighborhood character, protecting neighborhoods from change. And again, I will say this result is pretty stable across demographic factors. So I've included a chart here that measures the differences across income. So what this shows you is that across Rhode Island, about 70% of Rhode Islanders say that they would prioritize building more housing options over protecting their neighborhood from change. So that's 70% up here. 19% say that they would prioritize protecting their neighborhood from change. And if you look kind of down the rows of this chart here, I've opted to break it out by income, but these are pretty stable across bunch, other demographic factors. So, around 70% of our white and our Black and our Hispanic respondents say they feel the same way. They also prioritize building more housing over protecting neighborhoods from change. This is just the income example, also true across geography. So not just driven by people who live either outside of Providence or inside Providence, for example. Which I think is important because these new policies in practice are going to involve some trade-offs, and I think we need to be real about that. And what this result is telling us is that when voters consider those trade-offs, they continue to believe that building additional housing is quite important. Okay, so speaking of things that Rhode Island could be doing to build additional housing, I'm going to walk you through some of our results around some of the more specific policies that we measured in the survey. These are some of the key ones here. So basically, our respondents later on in the survey were just shown, this information about, hey, the state leg is thinking about some new proposals that might impact housing in Rhode Island. And then people were just asked, do you support or oppose each of these things? So for example, we included allowing homes to be built on smaller lots, provided that they're still connected to existing public water and sewer infrastructure. So this would basically say, can you build new housing, essentially on smaller lots, or can we divide up lots and build housing that way, right? Then an item on allowing faith institutions to build housing for people with lower income with a simplified permit process. We included, allowing, should we allow vacant or underutilized buildings, schools, strip malls, et cetera, to be converted into new apartment homes or condos, and an item that kind of similar to that was basically like, should there be programs available to help offset the cost of converting vacant buildings into new homes and apartments, where the idea would be that if you qualify to sort of do one of those conversions, that you would basically get a little bit of assistance to make sure that happens. Okay, so with all four of these, I don't want to bury the lead here. Each of these polled quite well. Just to put a little bit of meat on that. So what this tells us here every row of this chart is one of those items from the previous slide. So for example, what this shows us up here at the top, fully 90% of Rhode Islanders say that they support allowing vacant or underutilized buildings to be converted into housing. As opposed to my 2 cents here is that if something is 90%, that's about as close to unanimity as you're going to get in a survey. 90% support, 6% oppose. That's kind of free hugs for veterans territory in terms of popularity. That's kind of everybody gets a puppy. It's already house trained essentially. Pretty darn good. And similarly, we have about 80% of our respondents supporting a subsidy program to offset the cost of converting vacant buildings. So high 70% of people who support allowing faith institutions to build more housing as well. And fully about 3/4 of the sample, the 74% here, who support allowing homes on smaller lots. So again, what these columns over here on the right-hand side show is that on net, each of these policies is pretty darn popular. And also that, again, we see fairly similar results for these items across key factors like partisanship, like income and geography. Housing is one of those areas where there is, shall we say, kind of uncommon cross-partisan consensus. I think people, generally speaking, are feeling a cost of living crisis, are feeling the crunch on the cost of buying that first house or simply building more housing, and that's reflected in pretty consistent and high levels of support kind of across those key factors where you think opinion might differ. So for example, I think it's also worth pointing out that each of these policies are net favorably viewed by people who already own, people who rent, and then kind of within those are higher income and lower income renters and owners kind of within each of those. These seem to be doing pretty well. One last thing for me, this has been a lot of me talking, which nobody ever wants done, is that we did also include an item in the survey trying to get at the question of flexibility in parking requirements. And I have some colleagues on the call who, we sort of had to workshop this question quite a bit to sort of explain to people, what it is that we're actually talking about here. We really try to avoid policy jargon in the survey question. So we basically just sort of stipulated that what this question is about is do you support letting owners have more flexibility in how much parking should be can be on their property, or do you support kind of keeping things the way they are, kind of keeping the current policy that we already have in place? And again, what this shows us, this bar on the left-hand side here shows that a majority of Rhode Islanders support allowing sort of more flexibility in how much parking has to be on property for homes or for businesses. So the question didn't go into super great detail kind of about what that means concretely, but the basic idea of, if you own a lot, do you get to have sort of more flexibility in how many parking spaces are going to be on that lot? And, a majority of Rhode Islanders agreed with that policy. So again, just to kind of recap what we've seen here, I know this is a lot of sort of different policies, but the context here that's really important is that Rhode Islanders are definitely feeling a cost of living crisis. Just to quickly go back to the first chart here, this 47% who said that the cost and availability of housing in Rhode Island was their top concern. We've been doing some similar versions of this restriction in other states. I can tell you that this is absolutely on the upper end. So definitely a state where there's appetite for reform, shall we say? But okay, so I want to make sure we have time for discussion. So I will leave it there. Thanks everybody. I will stop screen sharing.
Thank you, John. I know we have a short time today, so excuse me, I appreciate you going into detail on the poll findings. And I'm very excited to have our panelists with us today, which I'm going to turn to them. As John mentioned in the introduction, we have with us Representative June Speakman, Senator Jake Bissaillon, Catherine Taylor, the Executive Director of AARP Rhode Island, and Randy Rossi, the Director of the League of Cities and Towns. each of these individuals to represent either key constituencies or leadership at the state. And I'm very excited to hear what they have to say. And so to kick us off, I'd just love to hear from each of you what your initial reaction is to these poll results. And feel free to ask John any questions you may have about the polling data. And to kick us off, Rep. Speakman, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Chris. And thank you to Neighbors Welcome and to YouGov for bringing us these data. Very important. As I have talked with Neighbors Welcome about lots, we need those of us who support increased housing in our communities need help making the arguments at local planning boards and town councils. And this certainly helps with that effort. I very much appreciate the across key demographics data because that does let us know that it's not just, people in their 30s who can't afford their first home, although we certainly want to help them, but it's across the demographic spectrum. So thank you for that. I also appreciate the bit about the fact that these opinions are shared from people who live inside Providence and outside of Providence. One of the things that we struggle with is the not one size fits all claim when we try to make reform in zoning or in other land use policies. And while I acknowledge that one size doesn't fit all, it's good to know that our residents across the state share these concerns. And that, again, makes it easier for us when we are trying to move legislation that would help address this broken housing market, that we have support from all corners of the state. So thank you for this work. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Rep. Speakman. Senator Bissaillon, your initial thoughts and reaction to the results.
Thank you very much. Just echo the sentiments of Chairman Speakman. Just start by thanking Neighbors Welcome and YouGov for bringing information to the forefront that I think it can be so helpful because oftentimes our intuition is proven correct, right? But it always helps to have data back that up. And what I found most interesting is, throughout the country, we know that there's an affordability crisis, right? And that can touch people and their pocketbooks, their wallets in many different ways. But here in Rhode Island, we know that we kind of have this 5-alarm fire as it relates to housing that rises above even basic affordability issues, polling highest, kind of not far and away, but by a decent amount, 5 points ahead of other affordability issues. And so I think what that tells me as a policymaker up at the State House, as an individual that has not an elevated role, but a more specific role as it relates to the policies that are proposed to deal with Rhode Island's housing crisis, is that this is something that's still on everyone's front burner in terms of what they care about, and really how it's what they expect their policymakers to be proposing solutions to and addressing first and foremost. And so I'm not necessarily happy to see that, but it's welcome to see when so often we're up there. Just last week, I left the State House after our committee meeting at 10:30. That that we're spending long hours dealing with something that's of great magnitude and importance to everyday Rhode Islanders throughout the state. A truly ubiquitous issue and crisis, as the chairwoman alluded to.
Thanks so much. I will go over to Randy next. Your initial thoughts on the data.
No, thank you so much. Thank you for including me in this panel. Neighbors Welcome. We appreciate the partnership with you and the great data coming from YouGov, and definitely the great partnership that we have with the two chairpersons on today. And I think us all coming together and working on these issues is the only way we're going to get through it. I'm not surprised with the data. It's definitely at the forefront and a big concern to all of our members. I think it's just the only thing that we vary in is how we get there. What mechanisms need to be turned and switched to get us to a point of growing that housing stock and making the most sense in our communities. The one thing that I'm not surprised about the response was about changing lot sizes, housing types, reducing parking, and so forth. In the data, my only offset to that is that it seems that every time those things, those changes come into effect, the NIMBY factor comes in, that it's when they're in their own neighborhood or it's in their own community. There's not as much support for it, which is disheartening to us because we do need to make different changes. We do need to make the changes to make everything work. And I think what it comes down to is once we reach the affordable level, which I know we're nowhere near right now, or the housing stock, is finding a way to maintain that affordability. And I think it's planning for those future unfunded mandates and future effects on the tax bills. So I think it's each layer, and I think that definitely the teams that are in place, I think we can get there, and definitely with the great housing secretary that we have, we're all walking the same path. It's just the little bumps that we hit along the way to get us there. So I'm grateful for everyone in getting us to where we're at.
Thanks so much, Randy. Couldn't agree more. Catherine, what are your initial thoughts on the data?
Thanks, Chris, and thank you for having this event and this great poll. I really appreciate that, and for the leadership of the two committee chairs too on trying to solve for these issues. I would say these poll results are really consistent with poll data that we have at AARP, with conversations we have with our 125,000 members. We've done a couple surveys of Rhode Islanders over the age of 45, and their top concerns around housing are being able to remain at home, and also being able to afford a place should they have to move. Say like 89% of people are concerned about remaining in their home, and almost 60% are concerned about where they would go if they couldn't stay. And as you mentioned, Chris, people feel stuck. A lot of older people are in the houses where they raised their families, and there's maybe one or two people living there, and they would like to downsize, but they can't. They have no place to go. It doesn't exist. Or they're concerned about being able to afford it because they might have a mortgage on their property at a pretty favorable rate, and should they move to something smaller, they'll just see their equity completely evaporate. And that's something that is really different than it was 30, 35 years ago, is that older people do tend to have mortgages now. The Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies has done some really interesting work showing that between 1989 and 2022, homeowners between the ages of 65 and 79, 24% used to have mortgages. Now 41% do, and the median debt shot up 400%. It's now an average of $110,000. So people are already really struggling to hang on to what they have, and they really, I think, get that we need to make a lot of changes. I was really excited to see, John, data about people's views about parking flexibility. We actually did a study too. We did a survey last September just of Providence residents, and 3/4 of Providence residents, again, across neighborhoods, across demographics, across ethnicity, income, 3/4 of folks 18 to 49 really were supportive of flexible parking if it meant more accessible and affordable housing, and 2/3 of older residents did too. So that was stunning data to us. People really understand that if the connection between the housing production and parking, what the trade-off is, and they're willing to make that trade-off for housing, not for anything else in our data, but they're willing to make the trade-off for housing.
That's fascinating data, Catherine. And we've been working on parking reform this legislative session, and it has been a very difficult conversation to have. And I view it as just the start of the conversation. I think there's a lot of education that needs to happen around the issue, and how we better use our land, both for homes and for open space and less car storage. I'd like to go back around with a second round of questions. Excuse me. I'm going to go back to you, Rep. Speakman. As chair of the House Special Commission on Housing, you have studied Rhode Island's housing issues from many angles with many stakeholders. And I wonder what you see are the current opportunities and challenges in the policy arena to meet Rhode Islanders' housing needs.
I think the opportunities are some of the issues that you actually polled on. We have some bills that are before both chambers now about faith-based housing and about conversions, and we see strong support in your data about both of those bills. So thank you for that. That certainly helps both Chairman Bissaillon and myself advocate for moving these bills across the finish line, as I know you will. I would also like to contemplate how these data and maybe any other data that you're going to collect in the future might shape choices about how to spend the housing bond if the voters choose to support that. And then to respond to some of the concerns that I often hear raised at planning boards, which were somewhat covered in your poll data, but also not, like often density. This is just too dense. Your character of the community sort of touches on that. But that's one of the concerns we hear raised most often in the suburban and rural communities. And then the impact, you've heard all of these arguments before, right? The impact on traffic, on schools, and on water and wastewater capacity. And, I'm not sure how you poll specifically on that because those are more, evidence-based decision-making. But those are some of the arguments that we see most often coming up in opposition to some of the projects that have been proposed. So again, these data are very, very helpful to show that the residents of Rhode Island want us to solve these problems. But I do anticipate that even with the data, we will still face considerable pushback.
That's what we see across the state, and I know you're no stranger to this, and I've spent hours in zoning and planning board meetings and council meetings over housing projects. One of the things that did surprise me in the data was that the polling question about whether or not you support housing, even if it means that your neighborhood is going to change or look different, that polled at 70%. And I think to me, that represents that some of the loudest voices at the local level that are coming out in opposition to changes to neighborhood and additions of new homes are a loud minority, that many other Rhode Islanders don't have the time or capacity, childcare, et cetera, to be able to show up at City Hall in support of housing development when it's proposed. I know that recently in my community in Cranston, there has been, the rejection of even single family homes, right? Smaller developments, duplexes. And, typically we see a lot of opposition to the larger developments, right? But there are a range of different types of housing that we can look at for different communities. And our goal at Neighbors Welcome is to help to bring those policies, highlight those policies, and help support state and local leaders in implementing the right types of housing in the right spaces, because we need all the units that we can get right now. Excuse me. I would like to ask Chairman Bissaillon another question. Similarly, what do you see as your role as the chairman of the Senate's Committee on Housing and Municipal Government? You've really jumped into the deep end on housing. All of these proposals come through your committee at one point in time. And I wonder what you see your role at the General Assembly. How can the General Assembly steer this discussion and really work on these policy issues that enact change across the state?
I think just to start answering that by, phrase you used at the end of your question, I look at, we're very blessed to have a lot of folks up at the State House, policymakers that are interested in this issue, right? Chairman Speakman. In the Senate, we have a great cross-section of individuals that want to work on Rhode Island's housing crisis. and address it through solutions that make an impact across our state, right? So I think about it from, we have Victoria Gu, Senator from Westerly, who's working hard on this issue and has been since before I was even a senator, Senator Coleman, Senator Mack, many of my colleagues who bring kind of I'll say a localized perspective sometimes. I think about, the discussions about ADUs that we can have, and Senator Gu oftentimes is speaking on behalf or bring to the forefront concerns from coastal communities where maybe, we think we do ADUs by right, just kind of in a blanket way that it's going to have this huge impact. But, maybe there's some guardrails we can put on from her perspective to really make sure that we're not just creating a secondary or tertiary seasonal housing market down in whether it's Westerly or South Kingston and places like that with short-term rentals. And so what I think is great is that so many folks, so many of my colleagues bring that kind of localized perspective and aren't shy about sharing it with me. And so I've appreciated that as I kind of jumped in the deep end. The other thing I'll say is that I have the benefit of representing Providence, Senate District 1, which is Smith Hill, North End, Elmhurst, an area that kind of has been hit from all sides when it comes to the housing crisis, right? I thought it was great to hear from Catherine about folks, aging seniors, aging folks in place, kind of who could sell their home for more money than they ever dreamed of. However, they would have nowhere affordable to go. And so kind of being house locked, right? I've experienced that as I've gone door to door in my community. I've also seen kind of the unique perspective or impact of the growing off-campus student housing population. I live 3 streets over from kind of where 02908's box ends, so to speak, of off-campus student housing for Providence College. And I've seen just how that pressure, bottom-up pressure, right? Because folks do buy these homes with creating investment opportunities, particularly as it relates to off-campus student housing in this area. So I've seen how that bottom-up pressure takes what I would say historically were multi-generational homes off the market. And so my district supports a lot of different initiatives, right? They acutely feel the housing crisis. So I don't necessarily have to be reticent when thinking of, I don't want to say outside the box, but certainly when developing a quick appreciation for new ideas. Just by way of example, I thought it was awesome that we polled how our faith-based organizations are empowering our faith-based organizations to work with us in addressing the housing crisis. It was something I heard about in the fall. And it's interesting to see that it already has some traction, right, in terms of positivity. I think that probably is indicative more of how folks feel positively about faith-based orgs across our state than whether folks traditionally see them as a partner in developing solutions for housing. But that said, I have the backstop of, okay, all of my district thinks we need to do something about housing, right? It is front and center in the Providence mayoral's race, Providence mayor's race. Like it's kind of been laid completely bare in my district. And so that really empowers me to, I don't want to say be outspoken on it, but try to serve as a pro housing conduit, as opposed to like maybe having to run back and think about how this is going to impact my district. I mean, there are definitely some folks, if you go to neighborhood meetings, who think, wow, we're moving really quick, right? People who don't, didn't expect that, and I believe it's been a good thing, but Mayor Smiley has been very proactive and forward thinking in how he has utilized the tools that state policymakers have given them in the city at the local level, whether it's ADUs by right without parking restrictions, right? I mean, he's done some pretty bold stuff. And so there's development happening across my district and the different neighborhoods that has taken some people by surprise. So there's been some, I don't want to say pushback, but it's definitely opened some eyes, right? Once the shovels start going in the ground. But I just think that I've been lucky to represent such a pro-development area in the state, if you will.
Providence sure has been a leader in a lot of addressing the housing shortage and looking at ways to build density across the city. I want to turn now to Randy. You represent all cities and towns in the state, and Providence is one community that has been really actively addressing a housing shortage and bringing new units online. But there are several other communities that you represent who are really trying to problem solve this issue and making progress. Wonder if you could speak to some of the highlights.
Sure. No, thank you, Chris. And yes, definitely Providence does get the gold star on what they've moved forward with Mayor Smiley and his administration. But the majority of our other communities are always moving for growth. They're trying to support housing at all levels and all types of housing. And I think we've seen that with the recent numbers of housing permits that have increased over the last year, construction activity in communities, and local leaders continuing to approve and advance projects. I think one of the things that's slowing some of the construction is truly construction costs. And a large majority of our, communities that have more land mass, they have approved projects, but unfortunately the builders aren't able to move forward on them at the current time, because of housing costs and borrowing costs. So we are seeing that as well. We do have some staffing issues in the municipalities, in the planning and zoning areas. So anybody that wants to be in that field, we need more. I think the partnership with the state to help build that capacity, they've created new programs at CCRI, and we're trying to get more people to exactly, Chairman. We need them. We need these plans and zoning.
I just want to chime in real quick there. I'm sorry to interrupt, Randy, but I actually sat on the working group, and it was like the most productive closed-end working group I've ever seen. Like as far as creating the new program at CCRI as it relates to planning. So we're creating that association. Sorry to interrupt, Randy, but shout out to CCRI for taking that and just running quickly with it.
No problem. Thank you for serving on it, Chairman. I mean, it's this team effort that gets all of this production, no matter what end of housing growth and housing production. But one of the other things that we definitely do need, and I know Chairwoman Speakman had mentioned about the infrastructure impacts in communities, and it is real. It is real, and it's not. When it comes up, it's not that we want to see slowing of housing development. I think it's to bring light to it, to ensure that it's done properly. Coming from Smithfield and being there for many years, one of the legitimate concerns in some of the areas that are proposed for large density growth is drainage. During those rainstorms a couple years back, I mean, neighborhoods were washing away. It doesn't have the necessary infrastructure in the community to be able to handle, additional housing or additional blacktop, so to say, so that the water isn't flowing. So I think one of the other pieces that is before the General Assembly is additional bonds for infrastructure and within the housing bond. So I think those are things that should be considered so that we can all work together and get this housing growth going. So I know the housing secretary and her team has done a great job, getting those funds out. There's been a lot of planning in the communities to see what additional sewer and water needs are there. So it is all coming, and I think as those green bonds and the housing bonds come before the voters, I think it's very important, for them to support that additional borrowing and making that happen. And one last thing to really help the communities on the school side is really making sure about the housing. I mean, the school education aid and the funding formula that will be coming before both chambers this year, and really coming to find out what the true cost it is to educate a child in the school districts. And if we can get the new structure in place, I know funding will come in time, but we need to start planning for the future so that we can start making sure that the communities and the school districts get the necessary dollars to educate our children. And that all goes in a nice effect forward as people want to move into these communities and and grow the school districts and educate our children to want to better themselves and buy their future house.
These are large problems,
Yes.
and every piece of it costs money, right?
Correct.
And housing is a key part of a growth strategy, right? When you're adding the right types of homes into the community to create that movement, whether it's an older household downsizing so that a family can move in, you're creating, a sustainable tax base as well. Because if your population sort of gets stuck and is just aging, you reach a point where a lot of your property owners are receiving tax breaks because of where they are in age in life, right? And they have no options, as Catherine already talked about, of downsizing. On that note, Catherine, I'd love to hear more about what AARP is advocating right now in terms of you've been an advocate for accessory dwelling units. You were really critical in getting that over the finish line and continuing to monitor that. But what are the other sort of housing solutions or ideas that are coming up through your network and membership?
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Chris, and for mentioning the accessory dwelling unit legislation. Thank you again, Rep. Speakman, for working so hard to get that done. Implementation of that is a big focus of ours, and making sure that all the cities and towns are, equally allowing them to happen, because that sort of gentle density, doesn't change neighborhoods. It just makes people who live in the neighborhoods better able to have the lives in the community that we want. And it's starting to be a real conversation around folks, who are looking at retirement and whose kids want to move back and can't afford a place to live, or who have an aging parent they need a caregiver for, where these people are really now understanding that they can alter their environment to accommodate all the generations of their family and a caregiver and stay in their community, which is what people want. And then another focus that we have is to ensure that new construction, especially publicly funded housing, is accessible, that takes into account universal design principles, so that the housing that we do build is housing that there aren't long waiting lists for just particular segments of folks, when any one of us could fall and break a leg and not be able to be in our house for a couple of weeks or even longer. So the more housing stock we can bring online that works for every person, no matter their circumstance in life, will just open up housing possibilities for people, and that's important. And then, this is not housing related, but when I talk about the mortgages that people have and the top things that people tell us in our survey make them worry about their housing stability: property taxes. 85% of people are worried about increasing property taxes, increasing rent, utilities, maintenance, repairs. Repairs at 73%. That's the least concern, but still most people worry about it. How do we help people afford that? So things like helping people hang on to their Social Security to pay for these increasing costs where they're boxed into housing and they have no choice but to pay for these things. That's another area right now, while we really strive to get more construction, to just help people afford to stay where they are while they're there.
I think affordability is a big issue across the age spectrum, right? I think, I have very close friends who, have basically just given up on the possibility of owning their first home. The numbers are so out of reach, and the amount that they're paying for rent, they just can't save for that down payment, let alone people coming, younger than us. It is just such a critical point that we do need a lot of different tools, a lot of different types of housing to remediate 30 years of not really strategically investing as housing as infrastructure in our communities that can really serve all ages, all stages of life, different jobs that we need, living and thriving in every place in Rhode Island.
Yeah. And Chris, if I could just jump in there too, because I'm just thinking about the reason I think that all this polling data is so strong and showing what all of us have been working on for a long time, and we know these things need to happen, is that we're finally at such a tipping point where I don't think there's a Rhode Islander anywhere in the state at any income level who isn't personally touched by the housing crunch, that isn't able to make a move. Their kids don't have a place to go. Somebody that they love is not able to live where they want to live in the way they want to live because of the housing crunch. And so I think people are finally starting to personalize it and understand what needs to happen in order for people really to choose how they live.
I couldn't agree more. I hear that all across the conversations that I have around this issue. We are getting close to the top of the hour, so I want to give everybody some time to give their final thoughts. I'll start back with you, Chairman Speakman.
Thank you. I did get a question into my phone from someone in municipal government who asks us what municipal governments can do to support the agenda that the state has been moving forward with for the past several years. They're actually, the municipal officials, as Randy knows, are the ones who get face to face with folks who are opposing development. So this municipal leader wanted to know how the polling data could support their work. I don't know if John has a suggestion for that.
Yeah, so I think the way that you put it, Chairwoman Speakman, and kind of your previous round of comments, where you were thinking about the current sort of housing situation actually is kind of an opportunity. I think that kind of framing of what's happening here, I think is really important. Especially, obviously, everybody on this call knows that these conversations are very different when you're talking to the people who show up to a planning board meeting, as opposed to kind of the opinions of people in the state overall. And I think really thinking about it as like, hey, the things that we support here, the policies that we support here, are going to improve the quality of your community. There was this great question in the Q&A from Jennifer, kind of about how people's kind of day-to-day perceptions of the quality of the community correlate with the stuff that we're talking about here. We didn't have a lot on that specifically in this survey, but I can tell you in other work that we've done, the things that correlate with how positively people feel about their communities are the thing that we're talking about here. There's things like, can I walk to do my grocery shopping? Is my community, is it well lit at night? These kind of simple things that actually give people like a real sense of kind of warmth about their community. So for people working at that kind of local level, I think being able to like talk about, we all knew this neighborhood had some, struggled a few years ago, but now thanks to these policies, we can see that this is a place where people, will go out at night and feel safe walking, being out walking at night, and you live within walking distance of your grocery store and stuff like that. And really, like the trade-off is that as the discussion becomes more local, it becomes more kind of vivid and on a personal level. And again, across the state, I think people are going to agree with that sentiment, and that's kind of my kind of general mindset for talking about this stuff.
Well, and thank you for that. So I have yielded my closing remarks to John, and I appreciate that. But all I would say is that we do need to push these data out to the municipal leaders so that they can use it as they think about the projects that they are faced with approving. So thank you to Neighbors Welcome and to YouGov for doing this work.
Thank you, Rep. Speakman. I will just add that, depending on what your role is at the municipality, at the municipal level, what I've seen really work is having conversations about development, about growth, about housing with the residents in your community before it's related to a specific development project. That is really helpful to get folks to really understand why this is needed, what growth could happen in their communities, and how to get them into the conversation early on. There is a baseline of education around these things, and there are very valid concerns that neighbors and people have about change. I'll just go around. Catherine, do you want to have your final thoughts?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you again for this wonderful poll and this data that I think is going to really bolster all of our work in ensuring, this is really where people want to go. And I think contextualizing it for people, as you were saying, John, too, making it real and vivid for people. Talking to folks in rural areas who are, concerned about different types of housing, but thinking, if you get to a point where you might need home care, you're really it's not likely that you're going to find it in your rural area because people who provide home care can't afford to live within even half an hour of you. So let's think about the sort of community you need around you, especially as you grow older, and who you're going to need to support you, and who you need working at your stores, and who you need teaching your children, all of these things. And if you want that in your community, then you really have to think about how housing will support that. And I think as much as we can drive that home and help people understand how vital it is to their quality of life to have housing of all types for all people, and the context, the community around it, like transportation, I think the more successful we'll be. But this data goes a long way. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Randy, your final thoughts.
No, I appreciate all the hard work in getting this together and spending the time with all of you today. I think it's all about continuing the conversations and educating people. I think getting the messaging out about what affordable housing means and what it really is, getting rid of stigmas, getting rid of people not wanting change. It's having those conversations. And one other thing that kind of popped in my head, I had the pleasure of speaking to a senator from a rural community, and this will help Catherine, is if there's a way to incentivize our elderly population to be able to have some type of offset in borrowing costs to be able to move into their smaller residence that they're looking for, a condo or something like that, then to open up that larger house that they're not interested in staying in anymore. To be able to get a family in it or turn it into a multi-unit at that point. So that was a suggestion from some more housing blocked neighbors in the rural community. So that came up, and just something to think about as well. But I appreciate the conversation and look forward to many more.
Thank you, Randy. And yeah, I think thinking creatively what will work in your neighborhood is the best way to approach this issue, because at a certain point, we are at that point where we all need to think creatively about how to serve our population. Final thoughts from Chairman Bissaillon.
Thank you. I guess final thoughts. I just to get back to what Christina was saying about educating, maybe it's incoming elected officials or even folks that may want to run for office one day or may end up working in the areas that serve, whether it's planning officials, zoning officials, is really an ounce of prevention's worth a pound of cure, right? And so that education on the front end can be critical. Second, as I was just writing down my final thoughts, which is never good because they're supposed to be final thoughts. I'd be remiss if we didn't just acknowledge that Speaker Shekarchi is now former Speaker Shekarchi, right? And he really did put this issue front and center over the last 5-6 years when it comes to state policy making. It synced up with it really be the crisis kind of boiling over in a lot of different ways, right? The words affordable housing were mentioned. That was one facet of it, right? That, increasing numbers of homelessness or of individuals experiencing homelessness is something that Senator Mack and to a lesser extent myself have worked on how to address, particularly when it was aligned with the new housing secretary coming on board. That's an entire executive office that never even existed prior to Speaker Shekarchi creating it. And so I just wanted to mention that because one, I think he deserves a lot of credit, right? more than 50 new bills, new laws on the books to make it easier to build in the state of Rhode Island, to not only to just make it easier to build, but make it easier to build with more inclusivity and certainly with higher and best use in mind, and getting rid of some of those hindrances. Even some of the things that we worked on last year as it relates to trying to require in communities over 35,000 some element of mixed use zoning, right? Because the reality of the situation is that in pockets throughout the state, but I would just say in my experience, pockets outside the urban core, suburban communities, on the edge communities don't necessarily want to fulfill their obligations in terms of building housing. I don't want to even say that it is necessarily welcoming to all, but welcoming to meeting the challenge that really is before us. Randy mentioned Smithfield. I mean, let's get down to brass tacks, right? The folks that complained about Rhode Island not having places affordable for their kids to come back to after college live in places like Smithfield or Lincoln or that sort of thing. I don't hear it from the folks around the corner looking to make their next rent check in Providence, right? I mean, it's the parents in those bedroom communities that really worry about where their kids are going to be able to afford to buy, which is why sometimes I feel like it's so counterintuitive and counterproductive and self-effacing for a lot of these same individuals to not want to support the huge multi-unit developments that are being proposed to address the issues in those communities, right? I mean, one of the things I was doing is I was trying to get together these final thoughts. The median home price in Smithfield was $525,000 last year. The median income was $101,000. The income you need for a household in order to afford that $525,000 house is $175,000. So, just think about the chasm, the price that now exists as it relates to housing and affordability, so it should be no wonder why it is issue number 1 and 2 on all Rhode Islanders' minds. And so the question is going to become, over the next couple of years, now that we're going to have a new speaker, who's great. I mean, Speaker Wojcicki is great in many ways, very forward thinking. But Speaker Shekarchi was very uniquely qualified to use that bully pulpit to help address Rhode Island's housing crisis. How can we all step into that void that I think he's leaving? And as we look towards 2026 or certainly the election cycle that's, we're in full gear, I think we really need to make sure that the folks that are coming up to the State House or being elected at the local level want to do something about this and don't just want to maintain the status quo. And so, those are my final thoughts.
Thank you for that, Chairman. And Speaker Shekarchi, you're 100% right. Just really brought this issue to the top and really has done a lot to make it easier to build in Rhode Island. And it's still very difficult. And we are still going to need strong state leaders in both the General Assembly and the executive branch, as well as champions at the local level to continue this momentum, because the work isn't done and the problem is far from being solved. And we at Neighbors Welcome hope to support everybody who wants to figure out solutions, policy solutions to move this issue forward. We are part of a national network that really does share strategies, lessons learned, and best practices from across the country, both state and local level government. And we want to support not only leaders who are in our communities now, but anybody running for office who really cares about this issue and wants to learn more. So we hope this is just the start of the conversation. With that, I'm going to wrap and turn it over to John Flaherty for final remarks. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, panel, very much. I'll bring us home, so to speak. Thank you all for attending and for your questions. One thing is clear: the polling data alone is not going to move policy or build homes. We really do need voices of residents who support more housing. We need that voice to get louder. So we encourage you to stay engaged, If you'd like to partner with us on a local engagement event in your community, please reach out to me. My phone number, my email are on the website. We'd be very glad to pull folks together in your community and have similar discussion about how to move forward. So we are over time. Thank you so much and have a great rest of the day.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you all. Have a great day.